let's dive into our last topic of the night, the CIA in Ukraine. What can you tell us, Lori, about the CIA in Ukraine and, what they've been up to over there over the past few years?
Well, we'd have to rewind all the way back to the very beginning, the very foundations of the CIA. It's important that people understand that the whole reason that the CIA was formed in the first place was Cold War foreign policy. It was anti-Soviet policy. That's the way that it was sold to President Truman. That's why he created the CIA. Alan Dulles and his boys were in Truman's ear saying, you can't trust the Russians. Can't trust the Russians. They've got the KGB. They've got this great spy network, and we don't have anything that can compete with that. So it was all about anti-communism and anti-Sovietism, anti-Russian from the beginning, from the get-go. That is, for most of the agency's existence, what justified the agency's existence, justified their paychecks, and gave them carte blanche to do regime change in communist countries and socialist countries around the world. And of course, the big prize for them in the 20th century was the Soviet Union. And that's why, from the very beginning of the agency, the CIA took a great interest in the Ukrainian nationalists, the Ukrainian nationalist movement. Yes, they collaborated with Nazi Germany during World War II. They were eugenicists and racists to their core, but they were brave and bold warriors and anti-communist warriors who wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. And you know what they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the CIA said, come on in, boys. Let's get you some passports. Let's get you some guns. We'll get you some weapons and some Jeeps and some trucks and some helicopters. And so they used these guys for the next 40 years doing guerrilla warfare missions inside the Soviet Union behind Soviet lines. They were never successful, though. I should point out that even the CIA doesn't like to talk about it much because these projects that they called them always ended in failure. The KGB was always several steps ahead of us, and they saw us coming, and they saw the Ukrainian nationalists coming. And, they had all these crazy projects like Project Aerodynamic, where they were parachuting guys in behind enemy lines. They were taking them out of West Germany and trying to parachute them into Ukraine, into the Soviet Union. And oftentimes the KGB or the military was watching them come down, and waiting to take them out. They would usually be shot on sight, or they would be taken prisoner and go to the gulag for a very, very long time. So all of these efforts were failures back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so the CIA kind of abandoned that program, at least inside the Soviet Union, because they had several CIA agents were killed by the KGB during this process. They lost a lot of their agents and their assets trying to do this crazy stuff. So then they started shifting to more of a propaganda war in the late Cold War period, like from the late 60s through the late 80s up until the Soviet Union fell. They were using the Ukrainian nationalists, basically importing them into America, Canada, South America, Latin America, and setting them up to do propaganda, publishing books, publishing newspapers, anti-Soviet propaganda.
Exactly. And just to clarify, by Ukrainian collaborators, you really mean people who are Nazi-like. So even if they are not identifying as actual Nazis, these are the same people who share the beliefs and worked directly with the Nazis. And
absolutely,
I think this really highlights an important point, and that's the fact that we really have to dive into what the CIA has been doing. And what you brought up on that Twitter space that we were on the other day about building a museum where we actually put
Yeah.
everything out there
What a
and
great
make
idea.
people understand what exactly the CIA has done. I think it's really important because it hasn't just affected America, it hasn't just affected Russia, all these different countries like across the world where these regime changes have happened. And a lot of times people don't know the reasons why there's war in their countries and why these two sides are fighting so much and why they just can't agree. And a lot of the times the reason is because there's money flowing behind the scenes and there's pressure flowing behind the scenes, and we don't understand where that's coming from. The CIA can be facilitating that. So with that being said, Lori, I really think it's important that we get a good understanding of what our intelligence agencies have been doing, because at minimum, they need dramatic reform. Even if it's not completely disbanding them, they need to be dramatically reformed and they need to have more oversight, because right now they're functioning as what's the word? The Gestapo? Is that the word?
Pretty
The
much.
Gestapo? Yeah,
Yeah,
the
I'd have to
Gestapo
agree.
for the elites,
Yeah.
with literally all the tools of the American government and the military and all the resources behind them you could possibly imagine. And they're Gestapos for the elite, controlling a lot of aspects of the American government and governments across the world. So, this is not to say, because I don't blame American people for what's happened, because we've all kind of been asleep at the wheel. But if America was to wake up to what the American government is doing and put a stop to like what these intelligence agencies are doing, I'm not saying all the problems in the world disappear, because they won't. There's still definitely going to be problems, but we might find that some of these wars that or some of this long-term friction that we can't understand why it won't end, some of that may come to an end, once we actually rein in these intelligence agencies. Like, if you go poll people around the world about who they think the biggest threat to world security is, it's not even close. Like, like outside of America, everyone thinks America is the biggest threat to global security. So, I think we need to wake up to the fact that the entire world might not be completely crazy. There might be a little bit of truth to that. And that's not blaming the
A
American
lot.
people. Yes, but we've let our government get completely out of hand, and we have the most powerful government in the world. So that's just a fact.
Yeah. Yeah. And I loved that idea that came up during our Twitter space the other night. For those of you who were not on the space, I'll explain it a little bit. And I hope that Kennedy listens to this idea and actually creates a federal museum exposing all of the abuses of the CIA. That'd have to be a really big museum. First of all, can you imagine? It would be as
That
big
would
as
be
the
so
Smithsonian.
popular, though. That
And it
would
would
be
be so
so
popular
popular. Yeah, a lot of
if you
people
did
would
it the
go to
right
that.
way, right?
Yeah,
You'd have the Guatemala exhibit and the Iran exhibit and the Cuba exhibit and the Russia exhibit. It would be huge. And then of course the Kennedy assassination exhibit would be there too. But it's kind of interesting. Do you remember about 20 years ago, there was a new museum, but it was not funded by the United States government. It was a private museum. It was called the International Spy Museum. And it was in Washington, D.C., and it was set up basically by a bunch of wealthy former CIA people who wanted to brag. Their idea was, oh, look how cool we are. Look what, we got the best spies in the world. Let's show you some of our cool little spy cameras and spy gear and James Bond-like devices. And they were trying to, romanticize this business of being a spy. And the International Spy Museum was popular for a minute, and then it failed miserably. This million-dollar museum that was so well funded crashed and burned, could not turn a profit. Not too many people were interested, and it's now out of business.
Interesting.
So
Well,
I think, you know, people were not interested in going to a museum where the CIA guys brag about their exploits, but I do think that Americans would be interested in going to a real museum that presents the real history of the CIA accurately, honestly, and critically.